All right. So in this segment, in the following discussion, we're going to discuss the meaning of a single word, or well, also we'll see it appears twice, but essentially one word in our parsha, and we'll discover how by really drilling down into the words themselves, even words that seem fairly simple, fairly straightforward, uncomplicated, there's a lot lying beneath, a lot of fascinating topics, discussions that are lurking if you just choose to go down this route, go down this path. And this is a representation. It's based on, you could say, an approach that I've been developing and honing over the past year, sort of a unique, slightly different approach to studying Chumash, studying Mikra Tanakh. And along the way, we'll discover, among other things, that there's actually a very famous word used in Chazal and used a lot in Lashon HaKodesh today, and it seemingly does not actually mean what we all seem to think it means. But more on that soon. So in this week's Parsha, Parshas Vayishlach, we have the struggle, the fight of Yaakov with whatever you want to call him, an ish, a malach, sar. It says, Vayei'avek Yaakov levadoi, Vayei'avek ish imoy ad ales hashachar, Vayar ki lo yochel lo, Vayiga b'chaf yerechoi, Vateka kaf yerech Yaakov behei'avkoi imoy. This is in Perek Lamed Beis, Psukim Chafei Chavav, and it uses a word there twice, Vayei'avek ish imoy, and then again, Vateka kaf yerech Yaakov behei'avkoi imoy. Now, if I just were to ask, do a survey and say, what does Vayei'avek mean, or is this a difficult word? I think most would say it's not a difficult word. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward, seemingly. If I put you on the spot and ask you, what's the translation, what does it mean? I'm assuming you would say to fight, to struggle, to wrestle. That's what we would say it means. So nothing to see here, right? But it should be enough. If you take a look at Pirush Rashi, it should be enough, it should suffice to demonstrate that this was apparently not so simple and straightforward to him. And in fact, maybe this is where we should point out, this is the only time this word, or this form, this shayresh, appears this way in Tanakh. There is no other place in Tanakh where you find this verb, Vayei'avek behei'avkoi. That usually, when you have a one-time word in Tanakh, that usually means that it's not so simple. Usually the more context you have, the more instances you have, the simpler and easier it is to pinpoint what it means. And this is a singular term, which itself might be surprising to some. So if you look at Rashi, you'll see that if you actually read Rashi through this lens, you'll see that this is not so simple. What does Rashi say? Vayei'avek ish imoy, Mנחem piresh Vayei'avek. So if we had to restate the word Vayei'avek, we would have to restate it as Vayei'avek, and he dusted himself or dirted himself. Which is obviously not a verb in English, but we'll create one, corresponding one. So he dusted, he dirted himself. Lashon avok, from the term avok, which we are familiar with from other places. That the noun we have elsewhere, but not the verb. But it's from this. The verb is related to the noun. Shemal and offer beragleim al yedei ninuim. Whatever they were doing was causing a lot of, was kicking up dirt. So by kicking up dirt, that's the word. Vayei'avek, they dusted themselves. They covered themselves in dirt. So Vayei'avek is like Vayei'avek. Then Rashi goes on and says, "V'linera, I think, shu lashon Vayetkesher." And again, Rashi creates like the corresponding form. So Vayei'avek, Vayetapher, Vayetkesher. So we'll see how we want to translate that in a second. But Lashon Arami u'B'Talmud, we have instances of this in Aramaic. Basar da'aviku bei in Sanhedrin, v'avik limevak in Menaches. Lashon aniva means to tie. Shekain derech shnai hamis atzmin shechayfkei va'oifkei b'zrei. So when two people are fighting or wrestling, so you're really like hugging and really sort of taking this person with your arms and really connecting with them. So Vayei'avek means, and they bonded, they tied, they connected. something like that. Now, I would assume the average loimed of Rashi doesn't necessarily think that Rashi is changing the translation. You go in with your preconceived notion. We know it means to struggle. Rashi alludes to the struggle in both cases. So maybe you think this is just a technical Rashi. Rashi is just getting into the theory behind the word, but I would argue that's not the case. Rather, this is one of the words in Tanakh where there is no clear meaning. There is no clear definition. Obviously, from the context happens to be on the clearer side, so it's not a huge doubt as to what the pasuk is trying to convey. You don't even have to really know what the word means in order to understand what the pasuk is trying to convey. It's not an unclear pasuk, but the word itself is not a clear word, and Rashi seems to be literally telling us that one possibility is Vayei'avek Hishtadlus, and a man dusted with him. And it's interesting to point out that in English we actually do have a phrase, a dust up. To get into a dust up with someone, if you look it up in the dictionary's etymology, you'll see the history of the word, and there were similar expressions, terms that preceded it as well. So there is a natural, intuitive association between fighting and dust. So it wouldn't just be like an artificial taich in the pasuk here. You could say, they had a dust up. Vayei'avek Hishtadlus, they had a dust up. And the second option Rashi's saying is, if you had to translate the pasuk, you'd have to say, Vayei'avek Hishtadlus, and the man, like I said, bonded, cleaved, connected, something like that. And the Rashi at the end also has this alludes at the end to shechoifkei va'ofkei. There's a connection perhaps between oivek, which is Vayei'avek, oivek, and choivek, although he doesn't really spell it out. He has this choifkei va'ofkei. Now, with that in mind, if you look at all the other Mefarshim, you'll see that they're all having the same discussion. They're all saying variations of these ideas, these points, and they're all doing it because the word is not simple and not straightforward in terms of what does the word actually mean. That's Rashi. Now let's take a look. Rashi does not mention the Targumim. Rashi mentions Mנחem. I should just mention that it's Kedai to emphasize. I'm afraid the average limit of Rashi doesn't really know what Mנחem is, but Mנחem wrote, I believe it's the first Hebrew dictionary. I don't remember the exact date, the 800s, the 900s. Excuse me. But he was the first to organize Hebrew words by, it's not really what we would recognize fully as shirashim. I think it's more like by 2 letters rather than 3 letters. So he'll group together a whole bunch of words that start with the same 2 letters, even if they're fairly different. But it's a dictionary, and we have it, and it can be found. I believe there's a new edition that was printed in the last year or 2, which I have on my wish list. I need to get. You can also find it on alatorah.org in their lexical section. You can put in any shirish, and you can see Menachem's dictionary, and you could see Yoina ibn Shanach and Radak and others as well. These classic dictionaries. So Rashi will quote Menachem's dictionary a lot. It was a very important, influential source on Hebrew. So if you want to appreciate what Rashi is saying, and Rashi keeps on quoting Menachem, clearly it's important to understand who Menachem is, what he's doing. Often looking up the context in Menachem in the appropriate entry will shed light, provide clarity. So, it's like I said, it's in Rashi. It's just you want to understand what Rashi's talking about, what he's referencing. That would be something to be aware of. So moving on now to the Targumim. Now, I think Targumim are very interesting and very important. I don't know how much the average person really pays attention to Targumim. Obviously, the Targumim are in Aramaic, and that's a big fun topic for some other time. The history of Targumim, the role of Targumim, the language of Targumim. We know that earlier in the time of Chazal and Eretz Yisrael, Greek perhaps was just as important or more important, but the old Greek translations have been mostly sidelined, have been preserved more by the Christians, lahavdil, and our Iker Targumim are in Aramaic, which also dates them to a certain time when Aramaic was an important language, a very important language, spoken by Jews, and that history is interesting as well, what language Jews spoke and when. But we have Targumim, so the most famous Targum everyone knows is Targum Onkelos. The second most famous Targum everyone knows is Targum Yonasan. But there's also a third Targum in Aramaic. If you look in the regular Makres Gedolos, you'll see sometimes it says Targum Yerushalmi, but it's only certain psukim. And that seems that's how that particular Targum was preserved through certain channels, only certain psukim. However, there is another manuscript. It's known by the academics as the Targum Neophyte, however you want to pronounce it. Mנחem Kasher called it the Targum Yerushalmi HaShalom. And the reason is because it actually seems to correspond pretty closely. Wherever we have the line, the shtiklach of Targum Yerushalmi, it corresponds pretty closely to this Targum. But it's an entire Targum on the entire Chumash. It was preserved also through some, I think, some Christian, very early Christian channel. But based on its similarity to the Targum Yerushalmi that we have, it seems like it's also eis gehalten just as much as the others. So we have 3 official Targumim that date back to antiquity: Targum Onkelos, Targum Yonasan, and Targum Neophyte, or Targum Yerushalmi HaShalom. And they often translate things differently. I saw recently, I'm not going to get into it here, but so interesting. Recently, there was a whole debate at one point about the translation of the get into Hebrew. If you were to translate the get into Hebrew, how would you translate it, certain terms? And in the course of that there was a debate between Mנחem Kasher and Shlomo Zevin. And at one point, Mנחem Kasher pointed out that if you look up the term Sefer Krisus in the Torah, you look at the 3 Targum that we now have, we have all 3, you'll see that each Targum uses a different term, and all 3 of those terms, each one used by a different Targum, all 3 of those terms are now used in the get. And he gives a whole list of other examples there where you have certain words where if you look up the word and it's an important word, what it actually means, you'll find that each Targum says something else. So in this case as well, the stakes aren't necessarily as high, but in this case as well, we have 3 different translations in the 3 Aramaic Targumim. So Targum Yonasan says Vayei'avek. Viyaebek translates as Ve'eskatash, and later with Vayei'avek is Ve'eskatshuse. Targum Onkelos says Ve'ashtadel, and later Ve'ashtadlus. And the Targum Neophyte says Ve'ispagash. But in the Neophyte, apparently there are also other gersais in the margins, going back to antiquity. So there's Ve'ispagash, Ve'ashtadi, and Ve'ashtadar. As we'll see, Ve'ashtadar sounds pretty similar actually to Ve'ashtadal in Targum Onkelos, but that's with a lamed in Onkelos and with a resh here in the margin of Neophyte. And later, for Vayei'avek, Neophyte has Be'ispagshusa or B'shadruse. And there we actually have the Targum Yerushalmi in the Mikres as well, and there it says B'shadruse. So that's, there's other translations as well, other languages, but for now we'll stick to the Targumim. So what can we derive from what these Targumim are saying? So Targum Yonasan is perhaps the least of our interest here. Iskatash, it's a term that seems to mean, literally means to squeeze, but certainly, without looking it up, it seems to also have a connotation of clashing. So maybe it means to clash or to fight. But seemingly is pretty much where we'd sort of expect it. If we were loosely translating it, that's, I think, sort of what we'd imagine the translation to be. But Ve'ashtadel in Onkelos, which is maybe the main Targum, Ve'ashtadel, what is that? What exactly does that mean? That's that itself demonstrates that this word is not so posh, it's not so simple. Ve'ashtadel, and also what's the Ve'ashtadar in the other Targum? So specifically with the Lashon Ve'ashtadar in Neophyte, it's interesting to point out that we actually find this Aramaic shirish in Tanakh, because we know there are parts of Tanakh, Daniel, Ezra, that are in Aramaic. If you ever manage to get that far, you'll see there are entire sections in Aramaic. So if you look in Ezra, Perek Daled, and Ezra Perek Daled is very interesting. This Ezra Perek Daled essentially consists of long formal letters written in Aramaic, correspondence between the opponents of the Jews in Eretz Yisrael. They wrote, speaking of Malshinos, we just spoke about the Malshinos of the Mittel Rebbe. So Malshinos goes back, you have the letter that the opponents of the Jews in Eretz Yisrael wrote to King Artaxerxes of Persia. They wrote against the Jews. So the Perek Daled reproduces this very lengthy letter, written, it seems, in formal Aramaic, and I don't think an original copy ever turned up, but it seems reasonable to assume that this was intending to copy and preserve the language of the letter. So you have the letter that they wrote, and you have the letter of Artaxerxes in response. So in their letter, they write umini sim ta'im ubakaru vashkachu dikirius adoch min yomas alma almalcha misnasa umerad ve'eshtadur mis avad ba. They're saying if you look it up, investigate, look in the Zechrenis, you'll see that this city has always been problematic. Yerushalayim, I think we're talking about Yerushalayim. Yerushalayim has always been a problematic city. It's always caused trouble for the kings. I'm actually reading from the second pasuk. The first pasuk is Yivakar b'sfar dochranaya de'avhosach usahashkach b'sfar dochranaya. That's where I was quoting from memory. If you look in the Sfar dochranaya, look in the Sefer Zechrenis of your ancestors, you'll see that this city is problematic and it's damaging. The Eshtaddur of the Begava min yomes alma. There's always been Eshtaddur there. And that's why it was destroyed in the first place. That's Pasuk Vav. And then the letter responds to Artaxerxes, and then Pasuk Yates, in his letter, he says, I looked into it. Bakaru, Bashkachu, Vitaka, we looked into, as you suggested, and Vitaka found, you're right, Kiryas Adach, Taka has always been a problem. Umarad, the Eshtadur, this Avad Ba, there's always been Eshtadur there. This is the only place we have this term in Tanakh, and in Aramaic, there's an Eshtadur. And we see from the response, it seems to be synonymous with a Marad. But what is an Eshtadur? So if you look on alatorah.org, they have interesting pirushim. Some of them are more obscure. So there's a pirush attributed there to the Binyamin ben Yehuda. And in pirush of Binyamin ben Yehuda there, it says, the Eshtadur is mered b'lashon Parsi. He says it means essentially the same thing as mered, but in mered, but in Persian. And he says, v'gam Vayei'avek, here in our Parsha, mitargem ve'eshtadal, v'hu lashon mochama. So ve'eshtadur in Ezra and Vayei'avek ve'eshtadal, it's the same thing. And what does it mean? He says it means mochama. And then in Pasuk Yates, he says ve'eshtadur or mochamas. Again, Vayei'avek, mitargem ve'eshtadal, lamed mischalav v'semreish, and lamed and reish are interchangeable, like va'aru in Daniel, it's the same as ve'elu. So Ve'ashtadur, Ve'ashtadal, Mochamas, Abikashima, he was fighting. That's the context is they were fighting. So that's what we know. Al Keneda ki Ashtadur Mochamesim. So he's making a link between that pasuk in Ezra, those pasukim in Ezra, and the pasuk in the Targum here. Now, earlier, a few days ago, this week, I posted an image to my WhatsApp status, where sometimes I'll post interesting things that I come across. Sometimes there'll be promotional material for these shiurim. So I posted an image of a manuscript of Pirkei Avos. The manuscript is known as Ksav Yad Parma in Italy, I believe. And it's a very chashuv Ksav Yad. I don't know the exact century it's dated to, but we don't have that many Kisvei Yad of the different Masechtas. So of the Kisvei Yad of Masechtas Avos, it is one of the 2-3 chashuv ones. And early ones. And I pointed out that if you look in the famous Mishnah, Perek Beis, Mishnah Hey, approximately, the famous line everyone knows, of Makom She'ein Anoshim, Hishtadlus liyas ish, if you look in this manuscript, it says, Makom She'ein Anoshim, Hishtadler liyas ish, with a resh. I pointed an arrow at it so people could see. I wrote, Hishtadler liyas ish, question mark. So I got a few responses. People saw it and they said it's probably a mistake, right? Why would it say? We all know the Mishnah. Everyone knows the Mishnah. The Mishnah says Hishtadlus liyas ish. Everyone knows what Hishtadl means. What is Hishtadler? What kind of word is that? It's not a word. So it's probably a mistake, right? But actually, if you look in the Pirush Melechus Shleima was a Yid from Yemen who immigrated to Eretz Yisrael, I think around the 1600s. And he wrote a pirush on Mishnayos that deals a lot with Girsa. And as we'll perhaps spell out in just a bit, the Girsa of Mishnayos, as we have it today, has been massaged a bit. There are parts where the Nusach we all know maybe is 300 years old, 400, 500, 600, or maybe there's a fork in the Nusach that goes all the way back, but it's not always necessarily the only Nusach or the original Nusach. And Melechus Shleima will be the one who speaks about it the most. So on the word, he's like the Minchas Shoy, you could say, of Mishnayos, perhaps. So, although he comments on other things as well. So on Hishtadlus ish, what does the Melech Shlema say? Svarim Achedim Hishtadler B'reish. He says it's not just Svarim Achedim. Achedim Mashma, that was Radak's Gersa. If you look in Radak and Sefer HaShirashim, he writes Hishtadler Kamei Hishtadel. And looking Ramban Ala Torah and Mishpatim on the pasuk B'chiyafata, you'll see also the Ramban mentions that the Nuschois, the Garsi, Hishtadler B'reish. V'chein Higia Rabbi Yosef Ashkenazi, who was an individual, interesting historical individual in his own right. He was known for being very into Mishnayos. He was known as the Tana in the 1600s. So he had previously also been very interested in the Gersais and Mishnayos. So he was Magia B'Shem Ureiv Svarim, meaning Rabbi Yosef Ashkenazi, the expert on Mishnayos, decided that Hishtadler was the Iker. He was Magia from Hishtadel back to Hishtadler. So that's what it says in Ureiv Svarim. And it's mitzayin to a Torah, which I haven't gotten to the bottom of what the tziyun to the Torah is. Maybe I missed something, but I'm not sure what the Torah is about. Now, before I continue and we sort of flesh out these Ma'ar Mekaymis, I just want to point out, people were responding. I posted the Ksav Yad. People were responding, and they said they were looking at the rest. It's a full page, many Mishnayos, like maybe a third of the parak. People were responding and saying, look at all these other what they believed were misspellings. The names are spelled differently. Other phrases were different. Instead of Lamad Torah Harbe, Al Tasik Torah, it says Imasiso Teirascha Harbe. What's a Siso Teirascha? And other the names Shammai and Zakai were spelled without an aleph. These are some of the things people were pointing to and saying it just looks like this Ksav Yad is full of misspellings. So surely that supports the contention that Hishtadler is probably also just a bad misspelling. Kisvei Yadar, they're probably less accurate than the text that we have. But the reality is that it's fakert. Like I said, the text that we have has been massaged and edited over a long period of time and has many layers of corrections on top of it. And these Kisvei Yad actually reveal sometimes it's just a matter of spelling conventions. So how you spell Shammai or Zakai with an aleph or without an aleph. The further back you go to Eretz Yisrael, you'll see that they used to spell these names without an aleph. And you actually find some of these names even in Tanakh. They had the last Svarim, Ezra Nehemiah. I believe you have the name Zakai, maybe the name Shammai as well, and they're spelled with one yud there. And then later in Eretz Yisrael, in the Mishnayos, the Drashim, Yerushalmi, maybe they're spelled with two yuds, but that was a spelling convention. And the aleph actually sometimes confuses things. You sometimes have Tolpolim. Is the name Reb Shimon Bar Yochai, or is it Reb Shimon Bar Yochai? Is there a chirik on the aleph? Or Chashmei, is it Chashmei No'i or is it Chashmei Nai? No one really has this question about Shammai. No one says is his name Shammai or is the name Zakoi. So people who have written about these words, and it's a fun topic. It comes up every year. If you think about the famous song, Martim Kol Achoi, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. So does it rhyme? Does it not rhyme? Is it a good rhyme? But the reality seems to be that all of these words, Yanai, there's many others as well, Nitai, Harbeli, bunches of names like that have this form, and it's really just an I sound, and you could spell it with one yod, like in Tanakh, or you could spell it with two yods, just to make sure that you don't misread it as a chirik, or you could put an aleph in there if you want instead, but you can't then turn around and then mispronounce the word. They're all just I. But that was the original spelling. The aleph spelling seems to be later, maybe from Bavel. And Masisa Teirascha Harbe, if you start looking, you'll see a lot of Rishonim quote the Mishnah that way. Another one that was pointed out to me, it says Loi haboishan lamed with a vav, beis vav yod shin. If you search Loi haboishan lamed, you'll actually find that someone wrote a book review for Haaretz, and you can find the article. It's accessible. Someone about 20 years ago, 2003, actually printed a sefer that purports to be the original text of Pirkei Avos before all the Shnuyim crept in, and it's based on the Kisvei Yad and all the possible sources that we have. And the person who wrote the book review of this edition chose Loi haboishan lamed as his title, as the headline. That everyone knows that Mishnah. And also, it's Loi haboishan, but Loi hakoptan. Both of them have a vav. And he says, based on the evidence that we have, that was the original form of the word. It's not just even a spelling convention. It's actually a different grammatical form. And then those grammatical forms fell out of use, fell out of style, and they were replaced by baishan and kaptan. And there's a whole sefer, person put out a whole edition of Pirkei Avos. It says there's not much else going on there. It's not biurim. It's just focusing on the language. And there have been these shifts, there have been these changes in the language and in the spelling. And dafka, people that I've already looked at these kisvei yad before, it's not fully novel to me for people that are not familiar with it. So the kisvei yad is surprising, shocking, or just looks like it's riddled with errors, but you don't realize you're actually seeing what might be a more original, closer to the original version of the text that then was edited in different ways over time. So here's another example of this, where it seems very likely, based on the kisvei yad, and that was Malach Shleima quoting Vayei'avek Hishtadlus, that the original lashon was taka Hishtadler lias ish, and then somewhere along the way, Hishtadler stopped being a thing, and Hishtadel was more familiar, and Hishtadel replaced Hishtadler. But what you're actually seeing is what's likely the original lashon. And so, not to the Mar Mekayim, so he's assigned to Sefer Shirashim of the Radak. So Sefer Shirashim of the Radak is alphabetical; it's a dictionary. But if you actually look it up, you'll see that, I don't know if it's on the website, it might just be in the Sefer. After he gets to the end of Vayei'avek, Radak says, well, that was all just the Hebrew. But we're going through Sifrei HaKodesh, you want to know the words in Tanakh. Aramaic words in Tanakh also, we didn't include those in our dictionary, but we gotta go through them. So he just goes through it chronologically. So he starts off with the Garsa Hadusa, from Bereshis, he just jumps wherever there's an Aramaic word, until he gets to Daniel and Ezra, then he starts, then there's obviously a lot more material. So when he gets to Daniel, in Daniel, Parak Vav, Pasuk Vav, in the famous story of Daniel in the lion's pit, where the Gzeira was that you weren't allowed to daven, and Daniel davened, and they caught him, and the king had no choice. So the Pasuk says the king was waiting and delaying and trying to see how he can save Daniel. Va'ad ma'ale shimsha hava mishtadler lahatzalusei, and until the sun set, he was mishtadler to save him. What does Radak say there? Mishtadler is mishtadel, better known even then in Radak's time as mishtadel. Excuse me. The Mishnah, u'makim she'ein anoshim hishtadler lias ish k'moi hishtadel. So Radak takes for granted that the nusach is hishtadler, and he says hishtadler in the Mishnah is also like hishtadel. And if you look in Pirush Rashi and Pirkei Avos and some of the kisvei yad, also some of the kisvei yad Rashi say hishtadler k'moi hishtadel. You look in Pirush Rashbatz. Targum Vayei'avek ish imay ve'ashtedel gavar. So he, even before he gets to the Gersa, he connects Hishtadel is ish Vayei'avek ish imay ve'ashtedel gavar, which already is interesting because I don't know if you would associate those two. Mela, the earlier ve'ashtadur, it sounds like a Muhammad, but here, what's the Muhammad? Hishtadel is ish, which we'll get to. He says, oh, that's about Vayei'avek ish ve'ashtedel gavar. Ve'yesh gersin Hishtadler. And the same thing repeats itself. You look later in Pirkei Avos, Perek Dal, Mishnah Yitchas, approximately the Al Tishtadel Roisei Shas Kaser Dachke. I'm forgetting now, but there's a lashon of Al Tishtadel Roisei. But if you look in the Ksav Yad, etc., it's Al Tishtadler Roisei. So consistently, and I think those, as far as I'm aware, currently those are the only two times this lashon lishtadel or lishtadel appear in Mishnayos, and in both instances we know it as tishtadel, and in the kisvei yad earlier sources it's tishtadel. So that's the Radak that the Malach Shleima was assigned to. We'll get to the Ramban a bit later. Another place you can look this up is actually maybe a little controversial, but we know that Eliezer ben Yehuda was involved in reviving Hebrew as a language, which turned into Ivrit, which may or may not be the same thing as Lashon HaKodesh for a different time. But he made a dictionary, and his dictionary is now online on Project Ben Yehuda, aptly named. And you can search it, it's searchable, you can search by the word, and look it up. You'll see, look up Shadar, and you'll see he has an entry where he quotes these Mishnayos, these Gersayos. He did a good job, did a thorough job, and he quotes it, and we'll quote what he says about the meaning of the word a bit later. Another place you can look up, you can look Aramaic words up, is there is an academic Aramaic dictionary online called the Comprehensive Aramaic Lexicon, or CAL for short, and you look up Shin Dal Reish there, and you'll see this is their definition. They give examples, and we'll get into some of the examples. They say Shin Dal Reish, There's also in Bavli, there's to send an envoy. We're not going to get into whether or not that's connected or not. Put that aside for a moment. But this use of shadar, they say shadar means to confront. And the first example they give is actually from this week's Parsha, from Neophyte, from the other Girsa, that Vayei'avek is translated b'shadruse. So that's the first example they give. That's the poil form, and then there's the espael form, to confront or to struggle. And they quote from some. They don't. What's interesting about this dictionary is that they quote from Targumim, they quote from Gemara, but they'll also quote from other Aramaic texts that have nothing to do with Judaism at all, or from other Jewish Aramaic texts that the average person isn't familiar with. Essentially, we're only familiar with a small, narrow window, a sample of Aramaic texts, but these Aramaic texts were existing within a larger context of all kinds of Aramaic writings and texts, and many Aramaic writings have been dug up from Egypt, from I guess you could say the former Assyrian Empire, I believe, was the one that spread Aramaic. Also, the Persian Empire used Aramaic as an important central language. So these empires, that's why Aramaic is in fact so chashuv in the first place, because they were the languages of these very powerful and influential empires. So there are many other writings that have reached us that date back to this time. So this dictionary is interesting that you can get a larger sampling sometimes. So they quote from some source where it also has this lashon yishtadar. Then they quote a very interesting source that there were Jews in Egypt, part of the was a Persian outpost in Egypt. It's known as Yev. In Hebrew, it's known as Yev. And to what extent their Judaism looked like our Judaism is questionable, but they're identified as Jews, and a lot of their writings in Aramaic were preserved. So there's a letter where they mention something about how Aleime Anani's servants ishtadru im viderang. So they translate it as confronted viderang. There's another example in actual use describing some scenario where it's ishtadru im viderang, they confronted him. Other example is Daniel that we quoted before, having ishtadel atzaluse, he was struggling to save him until sunset. That's how they translate it. And then they quote again from Neophyte, the other Gersa, for Vayei'avek Hishtadlus ima malach. Another example that they cite here, which I found very interesting, is actually from the letters of Bar Kokhba. They at one point they dug up a bunch of letters from Bar Kokhba himself. Now maybe with the news where you have militant groups and the militant leader sending out their messages. So Bar Kokhba was running one such group at the time, and we actually found a lot of his writings, the letters, messages that he passed to his lieutenants. So he writes to someone, we'll spell it out a bit in just a bit, the call to Elisha Amarlach, whatever Elisha tells you, avadla, you should do. Shadar ima b'chol avida, and work with him in every effort. So there, it's to work hard with someone. His shadar ima b'chol avida, you should work hard with him, meaning he's putting this guy in his place and telling him, don't do your own thing, you got to work along with this Elisha fellow. And so Bar Kokhba uses this word. And then they say that equivalent in Rabbinic Hebrew is shadal with a lamed. So these two words are one and the same, but in these earlier Aramaic texts, it was shadar with a resh. They also have another entry for stadar, and it's this pasuk from Ezra, ואשתדל, which seems to mean a rebellion, uprisings. They say there's also something, I think a targum for Eiv from Qumran also has a lashon krav ve'eshtadur, war and rebellion. So you can see that word being used there as well. It's not only Ezra that uses eshtador in the sense. You can find eshtador in some other obscure places as well. So there's a lot of obscure, but I would argue interesting uses here of these words. And particularly Bar Kokhba, I found interesting. You look it up on Hebrew Wikipedia. There's an entry in Hebrew Wikipedia called Yehonatan ben Baya Umesabla ben Shimon. Hope I'm not butchering their names, but there's a special entry. These were Bar Kokhba's lieutenants, and the article goes through these different letters and what they tell us that we know about these people essentially from these letters in the first place, and what these letters tell us about the dynamic. They say there's one Igaris, and it's the only one that actually begins with the word Igaris, and it's Bar Kochva writing to this Yohainason fellow, writing to him alone, and he tells him, and he asks, listen to Elisha, Igaris, Shimon bar Kuzba, Shlom the Yohainason bar Baya. And then comes the quote that we saw, the call Elisha, Amar lach avadla, Hishtadar ima, call avada hu shalom. And he ends off again, peace. There's an article, there was a big scholar of Aramaic, Yecheskel Kutcher. He wrote an article in, I think, the 70s called Lishonan Shal Igrot Ivriyot V'Aramiyot Shal Bar Kuzba Ubnei Doirei. And there he goes through some of these interesting word usage language, and he says, Hishtadar ima is not Lashon Shlichus, but it's like Lishtadel in Hebrew, Lishtadel. And others already pointed out that in Vayei'avek, instead of Hishtadel, Xavier Parma says Hishtadler. And we find this Lashon Hishtadler im, we find it in the writings of Yev from Egypt, Ishtadru im Viderang, that we saw in the dictionary before. And he says, compare it also to Psachim. You also see in Psachim, Mishtadel im. They have a Mishtadel im Adam Shasham Esachekeslai. So there it's with a lamed, but it's the same grammatical use, Mishtadel im. But what's interesting is the form here, Hishtadar, instead of Hishtadar, it's Hishtadar. Okay, that's already getting technical. So we're seeing live uses of these words. Now, based on everything we've seen so far, this actually, like I mentioned in the beginning, this actually makes us rethink what all these words actually mean. Because I think if you go around, we take a survey, we ask people, what does Hishtadel mean? Certainly in modern Hebrew today, you can look it up in the modern Hebrew dictionary. Hishtadel has come to mean to try, to make an effort. Now, make an effort, as we'll see, can also technically mean different things, but there's a very strong connotation of I'm only trying. Like it's not guaranteed. I'm trying. You ask someone, can you do this for me? Ani Hishtadel. Ani Hishtadel means I'll try, I'll make an effort, but adi adi nisht. So based on everything we've seen so far, that would seem to be a misconception. Or I mean, like I said before, modern Hebrew, Ivrit, could be different. Modern Hebrew can evolve and take things in a new direction. But what do Chazal mean when they're using Hishtadel, or as we saw, they might even be using Hishtadler? What do they mean when they use this word? So if you look in Viki Milon, the Hebrew Wiktionary, they write for Hishtadel, Asama Matz, Nisal Asot B'chol Kocho. So there's emphasis on trying hard, but there's also this trying. So if you translate it to try, is that correct or not? It would seem, based on what we're seeing here, that that's not the correct translation of Hishtadel, but really only the emphasis on the effort, or Haben Satan, to interact with someone from a neutral sense. So Bar Kochva writes in this letter to this guy, Hishtadar im Elisha, which means those Haben Satan, you should work with him, get along with him. Or it could be more confrontational, like the other letter from Yev, Ishtadrum Vidrang, or these other examples, Ishtadur, Merad ve'ishtadur. So we're seeing examples where it's more neutral, we're seeing examples where it's more negative. So, Ubamakim Shein Anashim, Hishtadar, which is the original Nusach, Hishtadar Lias Ish, doesn't mean try, it means make a strong effort, and as in like don't just it's a chumrah, it's adding, it's saying don't just make a light attempt. This is what you should invest yourself in. You should focus on being the person. I think this is even clearer in the second Mishnah in Pirkei Avos. Oh, here's the lashon. So the way it's always, I sort of read it in my mind, is don't try. But like, why would we mention trying here? Like trying, as in the sense of like you might not. Why is it so hard that you try? No, don't be misasik. Don't push yourself. Don't shove yourself. There's no connotation here of trying and maybe yeah, maybe not. Here it's, I think, even clearer that it's just means the positive part of making an effort. If you look in Ben Yehuda's dictionary, both for Hishtadel And for Hishtadler, he says, Hisdarez, Tarach, Va'amal. It strengthens the involvement you have. It's not a minimal involvement, it's a strong involvement. It just intensifies the degree of involvement, which, like I said before, might be neutral, might be negative. So that's what. So under Hishtadler, Ben Yehuda wrote Hishtadler Adam Lasot Davar Hisdarez Tarach Va'amal, and then under Hishtadel he wrote Kamo Hishtadler Tarach Va'amal. So Ben Yehuda himself seemed to have been very aware in his dictionary that it just means putting in extra effort to be involved with something. And look at the other examples you see in Chazal of this use. Ma yasa Adam Yishtadel V'yilamin es b'noi u'min ktana. Yishtadel means you shouldn't just try for 10 seconds and give up. Yishtadel means you should put in a lot of effort to teach him. Or lo'olam yishtadel adam lorutz l'kas malchi Yisrael. I think today commonly, you should try. If you have an opportunity, you should try. No, yishtadel adam means you should be going out of your way. You should be making extra efforts to always run towards malchi Yisrael. It intensifies it, strengthens how important it is. Make it your top priority. That's what yishtadel means. And see there for other examples even from Rishonim. I think if you read through the examples, it actually makes more sense just to say that ishtadel or ishtadler means making a very, very strong effort fully in the sense of intensifying your effort. And there's also a related term, lishadel. Lishadel means to influence. This will also tie in a little bit to Ramban later on, Yafata, which also sort of means to influence someone. Lishadel someone means to talk to them, to convince them, to persuade them. So that also is related in the sense that you're being misasik with them and you're pressing them, but there's no trying involved. Even the term we use, shtadlen, the Askanim in Europe are once known as a shtadlen. It's a whole interesting historical chapter. The term shtadlen over here seems to just be alluding to the fact that they're important people that operate on a high level. There's no implication that they try, they fail. That's not the implication at all. It's someone who gets stuff done is a shtadlen. So the question is, what exactly happened here? And especially since Ben Yehuda himself seemed to write it this way. Is this simply purely a change and innovation of Ivrit, which does happen a lot? There are many words where Ivrit is coloring our understanding of important things, Chumash, Chazal. But here it's actually, if you read the Yishtadl and Chazal, you touch it. You might just touch it to be Mishtadl, but it's a word that's used in our Yiddish and our English. But if you're thinking that it means to try, to give it your best shot, then it's like, okay, I'm trying, we'll see, either it will work out or it won't. You're seemingly misreading the intention in many places. Do see, we'll get to Ramban in a moment. The Ramban does mention this language of tachbula, but even the Ramban using tachbula, I don't think has to be understood this way. So I think this is pretty interesting that there's a word that we're all using, and obviously hishtadlus is a very common term, and I think hishtadlus also has that like ring to it, that you did your hishtadlus. That's often how the sentence is said. But lavdafka, that's what hishtadlus means. Hishtadlus means you gotta work very hard. You gotta, usually, today you could say, did you do your hishtadlus, or are you making it? Are you on LinkedIn? You're hustling, and your hishtadlus means to hustle. Doesn't mean to try. So that's first of all what we're seeing from Vayei'avek Hishtadlus, which we have to get back to, and all the other instances that we saw. Some of them, even in Daniel, which you could understand to mean he was trying. The king was trying to save him, but that's not what Ishtadal or Ishtadar over there means. Ishtadar means he was working very hard. He was putting in a lot of effort. He was doing everything he could to save Daniel. That's the meaning there as well. So in some cases, there's more room for understanding it either way, but in some cases, it's pretty clear. And as we're seeing, essentially, Vayei'avek here, which we have to get back to, is for translating Vayei'avek Hishtadlus, there's no connotation of trying here. It means that some gatzatan with each other in a very intense way, that a very intense interaction. That's Vayei'avek, that's Hishtadlus. What we're also seeing here, seemingly, is that the earlier form of the word in Aramaic was shadar, which is what we see in Daniel, we see it in Ezra, we see it in the original Girsa of Pirkei Avos in two places, and then it seems like shadal came later and replaced it, and to the extent that it even replaced the nusach in Pirkei Avos itself, people stopped recognizing this lashon hishtadar, and it got replaced. So again, back to here. So we have Targum Onkelos who says Vishtadal. We have Targum Neophyte that says Vishtadar with a resh. And now we realize they're actually saying the same thing. One is saying it with a lamed, which is the later form. And one is saying it with a resh, which is the earlier form. But they're both saying this taich of Vayei'avek, which also ties back to our discussion here of what Vayei'avek actually means. It's clearly not necessarily so simple in terms of fighting, this physical fighting, as opposed to what the Targum seem to be saying, which is that they had a very intense interaction, encounter. And in light of that, when Rashi says that Vayei'avek means Vayitקשר, even that perhaps potentially is at least close to the way Targum is going with it. Maybe not identical, but they're in the same ballpark. Now, Melacha Shlomo was mitzvah to Ramban, so we'll look at the Ramban on Kiyafata, then we'll look at Ramban here. Ramban on Kiyafata says that the Targum there says Yishadal. The man will be Mishadal, a girl. So Ramban says Atashon Tachbula ve'esek Asher Yaseh Ha'adam Acher Lasis Lekerd Seina. It's you're putting effort in, you're putting work to influence someone, to persuade someone, whether it's bedvarim Hishtadlus bedvarim or b'maisa. Ki kein Omar b'Vayei'avek Imoy ve'ashtadel. What's his first guy? His first guy is from here. Vayei'avek is ve'ashtadel. So just like Vayei'avek is ve'ashtadel in Parsha, so adarach zeh Yishadal Basula is also miloshin tachbula ve'esek. And then he gives other examples of Targum using this word, which we're not going to get into. And then he goes v'amru v'mishnah v'makim shein anashim yishtadel li yisish v'begamara lo'elim yishtadel adam l'tzeis tekasmachi Yisrael. Or in Daniel, have a mishtadel hatzaluse, mishtadel v'istachbulas, putting in effort. And then Ramban adds, Valdaiti mizeh lashonu, I'm going to connect it to Ezra, umrad ve'eshtadur misavad begava, mered v'tachbula rabba. And lamed and resh are interchangeable. He gives a bunch of examples of that. And one of them is the example we saw earlier, Varu, Sharshurai Shalshelas. And then he adds, so we even see in the Mishnah itself, we see the Hishtadel and the Hishtadler. So, he puts in the effort, he drays her until she gives in. And he says, we know the art of seduction. Pitoya basulis benyonim rabim, pam bedvarim, pam b'momin, pam b'sheker. Whether it's words, whether it's with money, or whether it's by lying to fool her. One way to fool her would be to lie and say he really wants to marry her. Lo yichud lashon Onkelos didn't use a particular lashon of seduction. He just used the general term asoi hishtadlus. He's trying to explain, the whole thing is to explain why Onkelos went with that lashon. So he's saying yafata just means you put in the efforts. You put in whatever effort it takes. Whatever it takes, that's yafata, that's yishadal. There, Onkelos says yit'e. That's Ramban there. Ramban here in our Parsha quotes Rashi. And then Rashi ended off with chayvkoi v'oivkoi. So Ramban expands on that chayvek connection and says, we see this avika and lashon chacham is chavika, and he also quotes these gemaras. And he says ches and aleph are interchangeable, so it's literally the same word. He gives other examples of ches and aleph being interchangeable. And we're not going to go through all those examples. Then he says, "V'shama hudas Onkelos she'amar ve'ashtadal v'chein tergem ki yafata arei yishadal yichavek v'yanashach k'shuderach hapitoi oy shlein azdam lo yilashon maso inyan tachbula ki kol ishtadlus tachbula b'tzidud inyan." So he says maybe, like I suggested before, that the ashtadal and what Rashi said is v'yitkashar, chavek, avek, it could all be sort of connected, and then the shadal by yafat would also be lashon vayei'avek, lashon connecting, yichabek. Here it's vayei'avek, and there it's yichabek. That the yafata consists of connecting, of bonding, of hugging. Shehu derech hapitoi. So that'll be one interpretation to make all these two uses of ashtadal go with even the ashtadal itself also means v'yitkasher. That here Yaakov and the Ish connected physically, and with the man and the girl, it's also yichabek. Or Shalein is Daman Lashon, or he didn't have any better word here and there, so he just went with a generic tachbula. So there was a tachbula to seduce, and here there was a tachbula to win the struggle. So Ramban gives us two possibilities, but we're seeing that Vayei'avek Hishtadlus, these are all at the center of these discussions for Ramban. Then Ramban, after all that, Ramban says, and the Medrash, it mentions that there was avak. That's different Menachem, who anachin. So in the end, he drops the whole mahalach and says that the best is that Vayei'avek is lashon avak, which is the first taich Rashi cited b'shem Menachem. Now, another source that I like to use in this type of context is the source of taich. Don't have time really to get into arichos here, but we know those who taich in cheder taich into Yiddish, and I have a whole Torah, a whole speech I could give at a moment's notice about how the Messiah of taich goes back at least to the late 1300s, if not earlier. We have very early kisvei yad that preserve these taichin for all the key words, all the main words. They're in the form of glossaries for the main words, going through Tanakh. So if you look in the most chashuv ksav yad we have for Bereshis, which is a manuscript known as Reichlin 9, if you look at Vayei'avek, you'll see that there are three taichin there. Vayei'avek un rang, Vayei'avek un heft, Vayei'avek un streit. Now, the Yiddish then wasn't the same Yiddish as we have now, but with a little knowledge and familiarity and a little use of the dictionary, you can figure it out. So first of all, it's interesting. There's three. Whenever you see three different taichin in these kisvei, you know that's another sign that the word is not a simple word, despite what you might think, especially in this case, what you might think in this case, it's not. There's three different taichin here. Now, arang is lashon gerangel, which is still a word you'll see a lot in the Chassidish dramatic writing for children. There's a lot of use of the word gerangel, which means to wrestle, to struggle, and that seems to be maybe based on the mahalach of chibuk. So Vayei'avek lashon chibuk is on the rang, so you're not going to say, and he hugged him, so what are you going to say? They wrestled. Wrestling is a hugging, fighting. That's the first one. The third one is streit, is lashon milchama, which is interesting to think about where exactly do they derive that Vayei'avek is lashon milchama. It happens to be that's kind of how it's understood to be today, but where did the taich get it from? And maybe it's starting ואשתדל. But then the middle one, Vayei'avek un heft, that's lashon kisher, karashi. So one of the taichin for Vayei'avek was un heft. He bonded. Vayei'avek eshimoy, a man bonded with him. That's actually the taich halacha l'maisa. When you actually have to translate it, that's the translation, or that's one option. And one of the kisvei yad, other kisvei yad as well. Most of them gerangel, it definitely became the main taich through the Chumash Beis Yehuda. But one ksav yad seems to say not streit, but steift. And what I think that's saying is meloshin shtoib. They turned it into a verb, shtoibt. So that would be based on avak. So that's we didn't see that taich anywhere else. They didn't go with the avak mahalach, but there is at least one that seems to go with it. So Vaita, you said it's mamish the translation. Vayei'avek, and he dusted him. This man dusted with him. But like I said, the main taich that the taich can go with is rang, gerangel, and Chumash Beis Yehuda says unhatzich gerangelt. There's also a French tradition of translation, which we also don't have time to get into the whole background. Very interestingly, the first, I don't have the exact wording in front of me, but often the French, especially, you could see the similarity to English, which I think also makes it very special. That it's almost to me like we have an English translation from 800 years ago from France, not quite, but almost. So the first translation in this ksav yad, the ksav yad Leipzig, it's from the 1200s. The first lashon, I'm just going to make it up from memory. It's something like ifu fudrei, which basically means and he powdered him. So it's the word powder in its original French form. That is the first. Also, the first translation it gives is lashon powder. They powdered each other, or he powdered him. And then he quotes Rashi, that Rashi says, ויתקשר, he doesn't give a laz for that. And then he gives another laz, luta, or something like that, which seems to mean to wrestle, to struggle. So here are examples of how they actually translated halach l'maisa, and we see also that it was far from simple, that Vayei'avek means to fight, to wrestle, to struggle. Wrestle ended up being the main taich Yiddish, but it's still not identical to fight. There is this emphasis on chibuk, the aspect of chibuk, presumably. And that's Vayei'avek, that the mamish were hugging and wrestling each other. Now, this is not just an exercise, theoretical, hypothetical exercise. There actually is a very interesting connection and tie-in to Chassidus. In fact, we find that these explorations, these discussions of the precise meaning of words was actually very important, very central in the Torah of the Tzemach Tzedek. And if you look through Torah, which not many people do, but if you do, you'll find scattered throughout Torah, there are these explorations, and Tzemach Tzedek is literally using the dictionaries. He opens up the Radak, he quotes the Radak's dictionary a lot. He calls it the Michlo. Today, the Sefer of the Radak had two portions. There's like the Diktuk, the rules of Diktuk discussion section, and then there's the Shirashim section. So today, the Diktuk part is called the Michlo, and the Shirashim is called the Shirashim. Tzemach Tzedek calls the whole Sefer Michlo. Tzemach Tzedek quotes it a lot, and he'll quote the Targum Unklis a lot, and there's a lot of this going on in the Tzemach Tzedek, and the Tzemach Tzedek then ties this in to, often he'll quote Kabbalistic dictionaries. Kabbalistic dictionaries exist as well. You have the Vayei'avek, you have others as well, and often in Kabbalah, in Kabbalistic discourse, the meaning of words is very meaningful, very precise, and has a specific Kabbalistic meaning. And you have dictionaries that sort of seek to lay this out systematically. The Pardes also, Ramak's Pardes also has a section that's a dictionary. Okay, Akinuyim or something like that. Specifically, originally, or mainly in the sense of which words refer to which spheres. But it's on the scale. There are so many words that you could essentially call it a dictionary, and there are many other such works that came along over the centuries, the generations. And the Tzemach Tzedek does his own version of this. But what's interesting is that the Tzemach Tzedek also combines the two. The Tzemach Tzedek will combine the grammatical dictionaries with the Kabbalistic dictionaries and try to find the commonality, demonstrate the commonality, similarity. If there's a chiddush in any particular one of them, he'll try to tease it out, figure out how it fits with other sources, how it fits in a particular pasuk, how it fits in with that pasuk. So in addition to all the places where the Tzemach Tzedek does this, Teich Kedei, B'derech Hiluchai, we actually find that in the Sefer Hakira, another very obscure Sefer, which contains the Tzemach Tzedek's Rishimis to himself on more philosophical matters. But in the back of Sefer Hakira, there actually is an entire section of erchim, of alphabetical entries, where the Tzemach Tzedek at one point started seemingly almost creating his own dictionary, blending these two methods, the grammatical and the Kabbalistic. And if you look there, I believe I noted to myself, it's page Tzadik Gimel. I'm not sure. I would have to take a look at the Sefer. Is that Tzadik Gimel from the beginning of the Sefer, or is that a second numbering that begins somewhere in the middle? But it's somewhere in there towards the end. And you look there, and there's actually an entry for Avak, and there's an entry for Vayei'avek. So first he starts off with Avak, quotes them to this tzion, offer hadak nikra Avak, dust, what we take for granted, but he's starting from the basics. So the tzion says the thin dirt is called Avak, and that's what the Michlo also says, the Radak says, B'sherish Avak, halaz shtoib, and the Tzemach Tzedek will often quote the Taich, which he calls the Laz. Originally, back in France and Germany, the French was called Laz, and the German was called Lashon Ashkenaz. But at some point, Laz just came to mean any foreign language, so the Tzemach Tzedek uses the word Laz for Yiddish. He says, Laz is shtoib, so, shtoib, dust. And he quotes a bit more about Avkas Reichel. I'm not going to get into all that. We have a Mishnah, Avak Drachim. And then he gets to Vayei'avek, and it's a very interesting discussion there, Vayei'avek. Dr. Tzemach Tzedek, some say that it's just its own thing. It's not related to anything else, presumably. It's just its own thing. The Hainu, Inyan Hishtadlus, the Imutz Ish Shareehu Lahapile Arza. It's when you're trying to tackle someone, that's the word Vayei'avek. It means to tackle. The effort that you put into tackle. Interesting, he uses the word Hishtadlus. What's the source for this? Kain Pirish Hakur Kadantzia. That's another big source that someone used. There was a concordance that had already been published centuries before, that sought to, there were already, I think, the Christian ones, and then there were the Hebrew ones that sought to collate all the words of Tanakh alphabetically and group the words across Tanakh that are the same shirish, the same word together. So if you look up Vayei'avek in the concordance that the Tzemach Tzedek was using, the old classic Hebrew concordance, That's the definition that they give. Avalad Adak for the Ibn Ezra, they said it's Melashon Avak, that's Lashon dust, we just discussed before. Why? Because they kick up dust when they fight. And he quotes Rashi, he quotes Mנחem. Tzemach Tzedek doesn't like this pirush. The etzem word, the word is used to mean a struggle, a fight. You're telling me that the whole word for struggle and fight just means dust. That's taking the secondary thing and turning it into the main thing. Why are you calling the fight after the dust? That's the main thing is the fight, and the secondary thing is the dust. Taka Chazal, Darshan, Medrash, Shehelu Avak. It's also Gam Kenichla B'Lashon HaPasuk. It's, you would expect Chazal to Darshan Vayei'avek Lashon Avak, but still to say that's the real pshat. And calls it Doichek Sheikar Has Abkus Yi Nikra Kain Rak Al Shem Avak. So you see, Tzemach has a very strong opinion. He doesn't like it. And the Tzemach Tzedek says, "U'ma nasa im yisabku zem zeh al ditzvas avanim." What if the wrestling happens on a stone floor, on cobbled stone? There's no dust. So what are you going to call it then? Yisabku. We use the verb yisabku, but are they being misabek? And there's no avak. Saying misabek reminds me that we actually find the Pirkei Avos having misabek taka in the sense l'chayra of again dusting yourself in their dust. Although maybe in light of this whole discussion, maybe we can reconsider what misabek means over there. Maybe it's also lashon kisher, but I didn't consider that before I got into it. Just a stray thought. Then the Tzemach Tzedek says, "Achim eloshin targum yenuson shetirgei Vayei'avek ish ve'atכתש and ve'afkoi ve'atketsh." So that makes more sense. That Vayei'avek is Hashem etzem husayin, and it means to clash. That connects with earlier with Rashi. When Avak, Rashi, there's a pasuk Afkas Reichel. Rashi says, why is Afkas Reichel called Afkas Reichel? The powder of the what's the term for Reichel? Not the merchant, but the fellow who goes around selling his wares, the peddler. So the powder of the peddler. Why is it called Afkas Reichel? Al Shem shekoitzen oisei, shekoitzen oisei v'oisen oisei Avak. Because you grind it, you crush it, and you turn it into dust, turn it into powder. That's why it's called Avka. So nimtze ha'avak nimshach b'noilad ayedei kasisha. The ikar is the kasisha v'eskatash, like the Targum Yonason says. And Avak is named. It's not the other way. The Avak is the source of everything. That seemed absurd to the Tzemach Tzedek. It's the other way around. What you were ma'abik turns into Avak. Whoever is fighting, wrestling, so you're trying to be kaisish your friend, your fellow, your peer, your opponent. If you're really trying to get the guy, you want to break him, you want to turn him into dust beneath your feet. Maybe something you would say if you're really trying to convey how in a wrestling match. So derech mashal. So Vayei'avek v'atketsh, you want to grind him, you want to destroy him. That's the Tzemach Tzedek's preferred. He didn't like the avak. That's his preferred. He says, Rashi said lashon ויתקשר. And he brings these examples of avik. Avik means to connect, to bond. So Tzemach Tzedek actually says this connect. It brings another chazal that Rashi didn't quote. It says in Erevin, it says my heketzir avkasa. What is avkasa? Rashi says chor shetzir hadela sevaboy. It's the hole that the tzir of the delas it turns on. That's how the door is able to open and close by the tzir being in the avkasa. And the Aruch says that anything that has a hole for something else to be placed inside is called an avkasa. That's what Tosfos say as well. So it says l'chayre, you could say it's called avak, it's called avkasa al shem the avak, because you have to grind it, you have to make a hole. Maybe that's why it's called avkasa. But if you were to go with the mahalach of Rashi, yesh leimar shazol iskashros, like Rashi said by Vayei'avek. So why is it called avkasa? Shetzir hadelas mekusher biha avkasa. That part of the door is connected to the avkasa. That's why it's called the avkasa. It's where they connect. And he says, and Yeshu Pirish Vayei'avek Hishtadlus, which I've alluded to earlier. Is Vayei'avek and Vayeskasher the identical Pirish? Is it not identical Pirish? You saw in the Taich that Gerangel is one and Heft is another. Rashi, it's not 100% clear, but from the Tzemach it's mashma, he's seeing it as an additional separate thing. Then the Tzemach goes on and starts connecting it to different midrashim. Avkas Reichel, that the Avkas Reichel is the Avak from Yaakov. There's the Zohar, the Avkas Reichel, Ihu Reichel, the Ihu Avkas delay. There's the Zachar, there's the Nekev. The Zachar is the Reichel, and the Nekev is the Avkas. So the Zohar is doing an associational link between Avkas Reichel and Zohar turns it into male, female, Davak Be'ishtoi. So that shtim is with the Mahalach and Rashi, the Lashon V'yiskasher. If Avak is Lashon V'yi'avek is Lashon V'yiskasher, so the Zohar Avkas Reichel could be understood to be deriving from that Havana. I'll point out that in today's understanding of flowers, so we know that flowers, plants also have a form of Zachar and Nekeva, and so we know that the pollen, which in Ivrit today is literally called Avka, we know that the pollen is actually the zera of the flowers. However, the way it's described and understood, that's the zera hazachar of the flowers. So it doesn't stem with the zera saying ihu reichel, ihu afkas delay, unless someone wants to put in more effort to make it stem. But that's just something. Once I'm seeing the zera make the association, that's the association that I have there. Then something like it's a kitzer. He sums it up again. V'yiskasher, v'yit'apher, v'etchteš. Then he connects it to another Mishnah, Mekvayis. If you're in Hilchos Mekvayis, there's the avik shebemerchatz. You have the drain, the hole in the merchatz. So if it's paisel or it's not paisel, and the Rebbeinu Shimshon and Mekvayis is avik, it's lashon chakak. The avkasa, it all comes back to this lashon avkasa, the chorish of eskupa. So weiter, the Tanakh says it all fits, it all connects. The Zohar said that the Reichel is the Zachar, that's the Yesod, and then the Avka is the Nukva, so that stems with it being a Nekev. Then he's been talking to the Aruch Avak Hasheni, Lashon Avuka, and the connection between Avuka and Chavuka. Why is an Avuka called an Avuka, a torch? Because a lot of wood are all Avuk and Chavuk together. And then he's been signed to Torah Vayishlach, which I didn't have a chance to look up, but seemingly ties into a Drush of the Alter Rebbe on Vayei'avek Hishtadlus. But it's not clear if the Alter Rebbe says this or he's saying himself. Yishleimar Shayideze Himshich Bechinas Avuka Begam Nekev Chakak Chaysim Shekeya. So the Tzemach Tzedek then uses this more grammatical, technical terminology, and he starts making connections and associations with ideas where the Alter Rebbe has a Drush of Vayei'avek Hishtadlus, and he starts connecting it to Simanik HaChaysim, and the Chaysim, and the Nekev, and the Chakak, and the Avak. They're all related, and it's the same idea. We don't have the time to dig into that. You look also, that's all in Sefer Chakira, where the Tzemach Tzedek Mamish wrote it like a dictionary. Then, if you look at Torah Bereshis, which was already printed by Bachovsky back in Europe 100 years ago more, which today now in Kahas is Chelik Aleph and Chelik Beis of Bereshis. So I believe Chelik Beis begins with Vayishlach. So if you look in Chelik Beis, but it's the numbering is continuous. So it's page Reish from Hey Aleph, into the Shima Al Kain Ois Beis. You'll see the Ois Beis there also is the same Toich, and the Tzemach Tzedek repeats a lot of this Chaimer. Vayei'avek Pirishashi B'chumash Lashon Vayeskasher Tikkunei Zohar. I'm trying to Zohar elsewhere. Ma'orei the Kabbalistic dictionary about Avkas Reichel. I'm trying to Rashi Avkasa Aruch Avkasa. That it stems with the Zohar. Yesod the Nukva. He says that's because of Rashi Shaloshin Vayeskasher. Ki Yesod the Nukva Hu HaEskasher Shalom Kabel. The Kabel Hashafa, Va'isas Atzmi Klei Reikon Mikol. So that's the Hiskashus of the Makabel, that you're a vessel, you're an empty vessel. So that's Avka, that's Nukva, that's Vayiskasher, it all connects. So it connects it all together. Ayin Sham can't go through it line by line at this point after such length, but recommend checking it out. And Parsha Dak, There's a Zohar that mentions avok, and that's stems with the Radak in Ezra. Vayei'avek lashon avok. That's the lashon in the Mishnah. Avak drachim. See barichos. The Alter Rebbe taka in Vayei'avek Ish. There, the Alter Rebbe mainly goes with this word of avok. So that's relevant to that. And there are a few Mamorim actually after the Tzemach Tzedek that quote these different taichin of Vayei'avek. At the beginning, there's a mimer of the Rebbe Marash, Ata Echad Vayishlach Tafish Lamed Tes, where it looks like Imamish copied the Chaimer from the Sefer from the Erkim in the Sefer Hakira, where he summarizes the shittus of what Vayei'avek is. And it's even from the Rebbe Marash. You look in Tafish Mem Ches, My Chanukah Tafish Mem Ches. The Rebbe Rashab also copies this language from the Marash, from the Tzemach Tzedek, of the different meanings of Vayei'avek. So, as I started touching on, started alluding to, when you have all of this background, so when the word Vayei'avek actually has specific meaning or meanings, then when you go back and look at the Alter Rebbe, so the Tzemach Tzedek Mamash turns it into a whole drush, whole mahalach. The Alter Rebbe was very bucky in all these inyanim, but he didn't spend his time being oisik in it overtly. When you start looking through the Alter Rebbe's Mamarim, after you study the more precise meanings of a word, you'll start noticing that what the Alter Rebbe says, his taichin, or if he has multiple taichin, often tie in to these discussions. So if you look in the drush of Vayei'avek, the Alter Rebbe has a drush of Vayei'avek, which Torah is one version. You can also see other versions in Tafkuf Samach Vav, Chelik Aleph, around the Kuf Mems, Kuf Nuns. So in the middle of Rebbe Tanacha there, he seems to use the word chibuk. He says, Vayei'avek is that chabek is chaveroi. He uses the word chibuk a number of times. So there, the Alter Rebbe, the Middle Rebbe, seems to be going with Vayei'avek as lashon chibuk, lashon wrestling. And then later, actually, when it mentions the avak, that it's lashon avak, hello avak to the Shemayim, asks it as a question. Avak zeh ein inyan lekan klal. That is maybe reminiscent of the Tzemach Tzedek's surprise. You tell me that Vayei'avek is lashon avak. That's not the main meaning of Vayei'avek. How does the avak fit in? And then the Alter Rebbe has this mahalach there to explain the significance of the avak. I'll point out that I think everyone very famous, pretty familiar. Sometimes we dig up obscure stuff here, but this is pretty famous. Sharet Shuvah of the Mittler Rebbe, and Sharet Tefillah of the famous Dibra Maskul Pada B'Shalom, which famously begins tremendous arichas about the two wrestlers. So if you actually pay attention, if you look at it through this lens, the only word he seems to keep on using is kiruv v'dibuk. That's the key word there. So that might be sort of building on the yiskasher. That it's lashon kiruv v'dibuk. Although if you look later in Sharet Shuvah, that's in Sharet Tefillah Pada B'Shalom, but later in Sharet Shuvah, there's Issa B'Rei Mehemna and Eis Gimel. There he mentions lashon chibuk. So this is something. Once you have the framework, you start looking and seeing which meaning different places of Chassidus are going with. And just to conclude, we'll do it very bekitzer because it's very late. But let's take a quick look at the Pada B'Shalom. Stockfart also coming off of Tes Yud Kislev, and and we're going into Yud Tes Kislev. So Pada B'Shalom is of course very apt. So the Mittler Rebbe begins with the Pada B'Shalom Nafshi, and another pasuk Kinei Vecha Hashem, Kinei Vecha Yevedu Yispor Kupar Liyaven. Says the Indian Aderech Mashal Shnei Bnei Adam and Lachamim Yachad Shekol Echad. Each one wants to defeat the other. Lachniyei Tachtav. Kinei Vehachrech Sheyiskarvu Yachad V'yitzamdu or V'yitzmedu V'yitzbeku Gufim Zeh Zeh. Mamish bonding, they're cleaving, they're coming together. That's Hanikra His Apkos, clearly referring to wrestling. Again, as we spoke about other Mishnah of the Mittler Rebbe, they're often very vivid, and the Mittler Rebbe seems to be very conscious of the actual musig of wrestling as we know it, and he's describing it and emphasizing this aspect of wrestling. Right today, lahavdil, we know there's different forms of fighting. There's boxing, there's other fights. With boxing, you're not hugging your opponent. With wrestling, you're mamish hugging your opponent. So Nikres Apkus, Kmoy Vayei'avek Imoy, Besod Shel Esav, Shluchim Yaakov Kedosh, Shinis Apku, Beniskarvu, the Kiro V'dibo Gomer. Vagam, that they're two complete opposites, or else they won't be fighting. They're total opposites. So there's a tremendous richuk, and they can never come together. But Ksherotzim Lilachim, L'Natzeach Zeh Zeh, In the Ozbehachach Sheyischabru V'Yiskarvu L'Sabek Zeh Zeh. But obviously, it doesn't mean emotionally you're actually close. Obviously, emotionally you're very distant from each other. You're opposites. It's just for the sake of battling. That's machriach, the dibuk and the chibur. That's called this abkus. Yeh ech sheyeh al kolpanim harei bo leklal bechinas dibuk v'chibur b'shah zoy shlacham yachad. There's this tremendous bond and closeness that transpires, that takes place. Lamaisa. So, and it says, and this is still in the mashal, interestingly. Ba'adei muvan, that just as there's a dibuk b'gashmias, kachu b'chinas ruchnias shel nafsham, shnidbeku v'nis abku beis hanefashim zem zen. Again, he seems to still be referring to the mashal of wrestling, that there's also this like emotional wrestling. The two nefashim are also sort of bonding with each other and wrestling with each other. V'adarabah, ha'ikar shel ha'dibuk v'his abkus hazois, u'b'chinas hanefashim shel ham dafka. The real wrestling, the real connection is happening on the soul level. Ki hanefesh hua ikar. Because that's the main thing. The Ched is referring to the psychology of wrestling, that the psychology of wrestling is not just physical and your mind is divorced from it. You're you're like coming, like you're mamish coming together with this person for the purpose of destroying them. That's what Tzedek said earlier, that you're trying to turn him into dust. You're trying to crush him. So I didn't express it as an emotional idea, but if you're saying you want to crush him, that I know lahavdil, when it comes to certainly to boxers, it's the real famous ones conveyed this type of strong desire. They want to destroy the other person. They want to see him destroyed. So I think the Mitzvah Rebbe is alluding to that somewhat here. So the dibuk and the guf is coming from the dibuk benefesh. So that means that their souls are bonding, are connecting, they're sparking off each other. You want to quell, you want to overcome the spirit of the other person. That the nefesh should lose all independence, it should become just subordinate to him, incorporated into him. There's like no opponent anymore that stands against you. And that's where the physical struggle derives from. That's where they're also struggling physically. To knock the other one down, to pin him beneath you. And it's all about the emotional, the psychology of the wrestling, of the battle. You want him to be completely subordinate under you. He should not be able to lift his head to be his own independent thing again. And then he compares it to fire and water, where either the fire wins or the water wins, and then there's nothing left with the other one. Then they both remain as they were before. Nothing changes, nothing happens. Nobody wins, then there's just two opponents as before. So before they were opponents, they were very distant from each other, and now they're coming together to the ultimate union, ultimate bond, where like if this fight ends in favor of one of the two, it's going to be the ultimate yichud. That leads them to this apkus. And then he adds, we see in the battles of the kings, that when does the victory take place? After when they're close. That's the high point. That's the dramatic the denouement, if that's the words of the battle. What's the nemshel? The nemshel is the beis hanefashos, nefesh lekith, nefesh bahamis. They're complete opposites. And shas tleis, shas krava. And he mentions there's two types of avodah. There's a tefillah that's not a battle, but then there's a tefillah that is a battle. And then it's a battle of the nefesh lekith, nefesh bahamis to completely change its tava of the nefesh bahamis. So that all fits with this mashal. So okay, so it's mamish like a wrestling match. And that's the Zayar saying the time of the hour of davening is the hour of battle. כל אחד רצה לסקבר אז לוסי להכניע לקול בוי וזהו שרש עניין המחשבה זרה שבתפילה. The real reason why the Mitzvah Rebbe is getting into this whole arichas is really because he wants to talk about machshava zaris. That's the real context here. So that's where the machshava zaris come from, and that's why he says you can finish davening and you find that nothing changed. You didn't actually accomplish. You didn't actually get the nefesh bahamis. You didn't quash him. And then in his Gimel, he gets back to this word of dafka, the yisabku v'yiskarvu. The whole battle is dafka through this connection. So that's why you're getting machshava zaris, because if you were not wrestling with the nefesh bahamis, then you can mind your own business and it can mind its business. So dafka through the wrestling and the struggling. That's why the machshava zaris are dafka bubbling up. That's the sign of the struggle. Then he goes into the idea of how every thought is eternal. Machshava zaris, all machshava zaris you ever had in your life are chayim v'kayamim. Going on and expanding on that, we don't really have the time to get into that. At some point, he says that the machshava zaris can turn into mazikim, that torment a person, that torture a person. The machshava zaris of neshama gavaya can turn into a whole entire nefesh. And then the neshama gavaya has a mekatrig, he has an enemy. That's his machshava zara, mamish turned into an actual physical person that's actually trying to torment him. So every person machshava zaris are then mekatigim mazikin that are trying to hurt you and harm you. So that's all to say. That's to connect it to what the pasuk started off with of Vayei'avek Hashem, Vayei'avek Hishtadlus. These machshava zaris explain they come from the wrestling, from the struggle. That's that vart. But then there's this vart of that the evecha, they're mamish like your enemies. Like you are in a battle with this whole swarm of oivim machshava zaris, and then he teaches Vayei'avek Hashem that you're trying to quash, destroy machshava zaris. He also mentions Yidua and if you're that close with Dibuk V'Kirov, so even if you win, he mentions chibuk. So even though he beat him, that's where the avak comes from. That's all birurim involved. This you're being mavar, you're also dirtying yourself, you're soiling yourself. And that's also by Avik now nefesh bahamis, bekir of gadol. Even if you win, even if you mahapeh chol machshava zaris, you're oiker kol ratzon zar. But during the battle, it's mislachlich b'levushin tzayim. So that's when you need a chitza v'shifshuf, which is another concept, and so on and so forth. Mitzvah Rebbe goes on to explain Vayei'avek Hashem, Vayei'avek Hishtadlus, and that's about as much as we can cover here. But I think the description, the vivid description of Mitzvah Rebbe of the wrestling can be slightly better appreciated in the light of the actual more technical discussion and definition of what Vayei'avek actually means, which, as we saw, was not as simple as we thought going into it. So in summary, we learned generally, number one, we learned that we have to pay more attention to words that are ostensibly simple but aren't so simple. We learned about the role of targumim, that targumim are essentially at a certain level the earliest translations that we have. So when you look at the Torah through the lens of translation, where you're trying to really get a clearer definition for a word, translations are very helpful, and the earliest ones are the Targumim, so that's the first place to start. We learned about the word Vayei'avek specifically and the different meanings and connotations, and it's not so simple. We learned about the Targum, the Ishtadal or the Ishtadar, and the Lashon Hishtadl and Ishtadder, and that there's a lot going on with that word as well. It's more complicated or less simple than we may have thought. We learned about the taich as well, and the very bekitzer about the importance of taich as another source of translation. And we saw the connection to Chassidus as well, both in the Tzemach Tzedek, and how he actually goes about trying to define the word and the etymology of the word, and connecting it to different ideas, whether in Zayar or in Chassidus. And we saw Mitzvah Rebbe's take on this idea as well, and the way the Mitzvah Rebbe depicts the struggle of davening, the nefesh lakis, the nefesh bahamis, the machshava zaris, and that's pretty much it. Of course, it's likely that there are other ha'aras that could contribute to this discussion. So open to and welcome any ha'aras. And with that, we conclude. Have a good Shabbos. Thank you for your participation.